Welcome back to Decarb Connect's podcast. And this week, kicking off our new series, we have David Lammers, who is Deputy Director of Corporate Engagement at CDP Europe. And we're going to be focusing on some of the developments in environmental reporting and what corporates and others should prepare for. So thank you, David, for joining us. Welcome.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And what we'll do, if this is okay, is ask you to kick off with a bit of a kind of a sense of how have you arrived at this point in time, this role that you're in, and what your background is that you're bringing to this discussion. Can you start us there? And then we'll talk a little about CDP as well.
Sure. Yeah, more than happy to. And again, thanks for having me here today. So as you already mentioned, I work as Deputy Director for Corporate Engagement at CDP Europe. And essentially this entails overseeing the wider corporate work that we do here in Europe, including disclosure of companies to CDP, but also looking after our supply chain work. So essentially helping companies to become more environmentally sustainable throughout their supply chains. And yeah, it's an interesting question about how have I come at this point where I'm at right now. So as a quick bit of background, I started off with a business background, business studies, and worked as a corporate consultant for a number of years then. And yeah, then at some point decided I actually see challenges that are just broader and to my mind more urgent than the exact topics that I was working on. And that's what brought me into essentially doing a further study program on sustainability science, environmental studies. And that was in 2013-14, so just before the Paris Agreement came into play. I would say the urgency of the matter was already quite obvious, but it didn't have yet this sort of this absolute attention from the global also media space and society. But yeah, from there on, I essentially try to find ways how I can combine my business background with this absolute drive to achieve this mission that I had picked up through my studies. And CDP was just a perfect place to be at, to be honest, because it is an NGO, it is a non-profit organization, but it works really closely with the global economies to ensure we are seeing the transformation from the corporate sector that we need to see. So I had also a good amount of chance to bring in my business perspectives into that. And yeah, that's where I am right now.
And CDP itself, I mean, I sort of remember reading about climate disclosure, I suppose first maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I know it's been around longer than that, but that was when it first became something I had an understanding of. But just tell us a little bit about the remit of the organization and how it's shifting.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting to say that you say that, and to be fair, I think that would hold true for most people, that they've really, unless they were really in the field, that they'd probably only come across sort of the wider disclosure and seen how widespread it is over the last couple of years. But CDP actually, as an organization, has been around for 20 years now, so we've had our 20th anniversary. But really started off as a startup with 3 people putting their heads together and thinking about what type of information made a financial market in the first place benefit from corporations in order to know how they are behaving on the environmental side. And this was 2000, right? So this was a very different time, and the attention on this topic was obviously far from where it is today. And yeah, these guys back then, our founders, started off really in a basement, classic startup style, and actually ended up printing questionnaires, putting them into envelopes, and postal mailing them out to the companies. And yeah, from there we have obviously evolved quite a good bit. We are having more than 10,000 corporations across the globe that fill out it's still a questionnaire, but obviously more of a reporting framework each year these days. It's of course happening digitally, so via an online platform. And yeah, we are also, as an organization, have grown to more than 500 employees across the globe and are really acting in an integrated, still regionally focused fashion, I would say. And what's also worthwhile to mention is that over time, CDP also ensured that we extend the focus beyond the climate challenge, because that's obviously one thing to start with, and arguably the most urgent challenge that we need to face and need to solve. But Climate change in particular doesn't count or has a lot of interrelations, of course, with other environmental dimensions. And two of the subjects in particular that CDP placed importance on over the time were water security, which in itself is, of course, a major item to look at. Freshwater availability is going down in many parts of the world, but also, of course, for many of the climate strategies that we're wanting to put in place, having fresh water available in abundant amounts is extremely important. And then finally, the forest space. Deforestation has, of course, been one of the other major challenges that we've seen, again, very closely tied to the climate agenda, but also in itself having tremendous biodiversity impacts, and of course also social dimensions. And those are the topics that CDP added in over the time. And yes, at this point, we have about more than 10,000 organizations disclosing on their climate impact, around 3,000 on their water impact, and 700 on their forest impact. The latter two being topics that are also not exactly relevant for each and every single type of industry, and therefore also a bit reduced in scope.
And that number of 10,000 who are disclosing data around climate, just tell us a bit, what kind of growth is that you're seeing? So how are those changing?
Yeah. So what I can say is that with each year over the last couple of years, I would say we've seen another 1,000 companies be added to this set of companies, so to say. So the number has increased by around 1,000, a bit more actually year by year. And I can already say that this year we'll see another increase. I can't unfortunately give you the exact numbers as of yet, as the cycle is still in finalization, but we'll see the updated figures in mid-October. That's when we'll launch them. And yeah, we can see, especially on the climate side, that the topic is growing in further in attention, essentially. But from a relative perspective, the water and forest programs have actually grown stronger. So on the forest side, we've seen in Europe in particular 25 to 30% year over year over the last 2 or so years. So which also is due to the fact that there's still more room for improvement, still fewer companies from a baseline perspective that have taken care of this, but it is one item that we see is also gaining attention.
And then on the other side, how are things changing or growing in terms of those using the data sets that you're building?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So on the user side, I briefly mentioned that the initiator or the initial supporters of the CDP system were really coming from the financial market, and that is still the case these days. So the mandate for us to request companies to provide data is strongly coming from the investor space, which have a strong requirement for these data in order to be able to assess the sustainability of their portfolios and lending portfolios as well. Actually, as a second sort of data user side, I do want to mention the corporate buyers, because since 10 or so years, CDP has also allowed corporations themselves to use the same disclosure framework for their suppliers. So asking suppliers to also respond to the same set of questions, and thereby gaining a better understanding of how sustainable their supply chain currently is, and where there are emissions hotspots to be worked on. And what we see is on the user side, I would say that in the beginning, it was probably more, especially on the financial market side, something that they thought they would support more from a moral perspective, and because they felt it, on the one hand, doesn't hurt to support it, and it's something almost like a CSR measure to put your name towards an initiative of this kind. But what we've seen over the last couple of years, really, I would say, is that this is completely switched to more and more investors having an absolute need for this data, and really being scrutinized themselves actually on how they invest and where they invest in. And in order to be able to answer this, they need the data from the corporation. So I can give a few examples in the follow-up if you want, about some exact sort of investment products and so on. But that's I would say the big change that we've seen over the years, and that the investors don't have another choice anymore themselves, to be honest. They need the data and they need to ask for it.
You think about the kind of last 18 months, 18 to 24 months. I mean, most people that come on here, I think we're all in agreement that there's been this big shift in momentum in the last, particularly 12 to 18 months. But over the last kind of couple of years, what have you seen changing in terms of the data and trends that you're observing coming out of the project? What are some of the highlights or kind of points of interest that you draw our attention to?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, and yeah, related to what I mentioned earlier, generally the level of scrutiny and the level of attention towards these data points is certainly increased, which also means, yeah, these are being looked at in a more granular and also more diligent fashion, I would say, from any type of data user that you'll have. But in terms of yeah, the types of sort of data points and areas of interest that we see, one thing that I clearly like to mention is on the target side, on the ambition side, maybe to mention as one aspect from CDP's framework, we've usually been a framework that doesn't only look at the current impact or sort of the not even the past emissions of a company, but really want to explore how a company is setting themselves up to decarbonize really going forward, and will they still be in a position to prosper and to operate in a low carbon environment. And this is really also what data users and again particularly investors are interested in. They're not so much actually involved with yeah, as said, a company's historical footprint, but they want to know if they invest in this company, will they still be yeah, a company that they can trust to be a solid portfolio company in 10 and 20 years from now on. And that's why on the data side there's a lot of attention on the targets that companies set themselves, the emission reduction targets. And to be a bit more precise even, certainly many people on this podcast may be aware that when it comes to reduction targets, the so-called Science-Based Targets Initiative had emerged over the last couple of years as sort of the de facto standard for setting ambitious reduction targets for the short to mid-term, so looking to 5 to 15 years in the future, and assessing to what degree these targets are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Firstly, these targets are in more and more demand from the data user side, so they really want to see, are companies setting these targets and are they also following up on it? But as a second component, and this is maybe a bit more recent, the long-term perspective has come into much more attention. And that's often also talked about as the net zero strategy or the net zero ambition of companies. And I'm sure you've heard or you've used the term a lot also on this podcast before. What we've seen is that companies had started already to set themselves a net zero ambition or carbon neutrality ambition, and partially in interchangeable terms, but there hadn't been the same level of sort of standardized framework to assess whether a company's target actually leads to this company being neutral at a foreseeable point in time in the future. And this is the added element that the very same Science-Based Target Initiative will actually add in, is currently finalizing, will be released over COP. But yeah, that's why we believe also from the data user, from the investment market perspective, there's going to be a lot more attention on do companies also have a net zero target? By when do they want to be net zero, and what are the means they are putting in place to achieve this? And if I may just say one last thing, because I think it's also of interest for the companies to hear. What I said before, if investors look at the companies, they're really looking at it from a sustainability perspective, also from for their portfolio. So they want to see, will a company be able to operate profitably in a low carbon society? And that's why an actual low carbon transition plan, how to transform your business model to adapt to the low carbon society, is really, really important. Also thinking of which opportunities occur for you in a lower carbon future. So do you have products or services in place that actually make you gain business potentially in a future that is dependent on yeah, lower emissions? And this is something that we always feel can be quite encouraging for companies to know. It's not just about yourself reducing your footprint, but it's also of interest to see, are you an innovative company that delivers products and services that will help others to do their part of the job?
So in terms of trends, we've got this first one, which is about more commitments being made, and perhaps more interestingly, those commitments shaping up to be more within that SBTi environment. And then secondly, people really pointing more towards opportunity and not just challenges around climate issues within their businesses.
Yeah, I would say so. And then this opportunity aspect isn't particularly new, but it's part of what I mentioned, this low carbon transition plan, which certainly should have a role to play in there as well. If you have a holistic plan for your company, how will you operate in a low carbon society? Yes, place absolute attention on how will you reduce your own, but do not forget about sort of this opportunity angle and the business potential that you may find there for your company.
Okay, so that leads me into my, I guess, a next area of questioning for you, which is, whether you're focused on what the energy intensive sectors are doing, which is very much Decarb Connect's field of vision, or whether you're looking more generally at what corporates and industry are doing. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in how this kind of uptick in targets and the ambitions that people are stating, how is it actually affecting reporting content and reporting activity? Obviously, you've talked about it, obviously leading to a growth in the number of people reporting, but how is it actually changing the data and the content that you see?
So firstly, I would say from a reporting perspective, if we think about the long-term targets, the net zero targets that I just described, that look into 20 years in the future, 30 years in the future, there will be higher attention and higher need to report accurately on your progress against these targets. So let's say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the main interest of a reader, of a data user may have been on which target have you already set, but going forward, we will see more attention on, are you on track to this? So also from a reporter perspective, I think this is where companies will, of course, have to establish solid tracking mechanisms where they stand in respect to these targets in particular. And for the hard to abate sectors that you also mentioned yourself, where everyone is aware that the solutions right now to achieve these targets aren't actually in place. It will also be important to report on and bring about some transparency on what are you investing to make those solutions happen. I think we're all aware we don't know the solution yet, but investors will want to see, are you putting down money into research projects? Where's your R&D spending going to? Is it essentially still going into the same technologies and just improving them? Or is it also going into some type of disruptive technologies? And also essentially, are you still making I would say regular progress, or are you putting all your bets on this one big emerging technology that you hope to see coming into place in 10 years? Because that, of course, may also be a big bet that may not be fully satisfying for investors to see. So where are you going in the future? What is your ambition, but also how are you aiming to achieve this? I think is going to be a big question for the reporting side going forward.
The other side of, as people set targets and as they state ambitions and as they report more and more, I imagine that the kind of questioning of just how is my data actually used probably only gains significance. So I mean, we've heard this from a couple of our members, the sort of an interest in how the data submitted through CDP is actually used by investors, whether at capital market scale or other. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. And I believe it's an important question because after all, we know it's a big effort for corporations to pull these data together. It's also often, thanks to the very strong commitment that we see from individuals in their corporate sustainability departments, that when the deadline for reporting approaches are spending long days and nights partially to bring this data into good shape. So I think it's an absolutely fair and valid question to ask. Maybe to start with mentioning one aspect that I hadn't talked too much about so far, besides providing this reporting framework, of course, CDP also scores the companies that report through us. So we essentially assign a score between A and D, indicating from a fairly holistic fashion, I would say, how advanced we see a company in not only the reductions that they have already achieved, but in setting themselves up, making themselves transition ready, so to say, from a governance, procedural setup, and so on and so forth. And these scores actually can be a very good proxy for where the company stands, and that's why data users like to really build them into their investment products right now. So to give a few examples, Stocks, who are the index provider for the German stock index, they have built a couple of stock indices where investors can decide, for instance, only to invest in companies that have achieved a CDP A score or a B score. You can actually, make the score as you like, but the score is essentially the pre-filter for this. Similarly, Amundi, the biggest asset manager in Europe, has set up a climate action fund, which essentially takes the complete investment universe, but then also uses CDP scores and the science-based target commitment as a filter to then sort of lower the investment universe and into a dedicated set, which then the fund managers can essentially pick and choose from. But being used as a pre-filter is one of these. But yeah, besides the scores, the data itself is also being used in various forms, of course. So firstly, as said, on the target side, this can actually now be used and is being used also more from investors to try to identify the temperature alignment of their portfolio. So if they know what we call the temperature alignment of each of their companies, meaning if a company pursues on their decarbonization ambition, would this fall in line with the 2-degree future or 1.5 degree future or 3-degree future, and trying to aggregate this, you can essentially derive the so-called temperature alignment of your portfolio. And this is something that CDP has also been working on with some investors lately, and is of course a very powerful tool for investors to make use of the target data that companies have been responding.
Yeah, I can almost feel the kind of amongst the listener base, a kind of equal combination of, oh, that's exciting, and oh, blimey, that's terrifying. For companies that have a more challenging transition process to go through, that kind of filtering process obviously causes some alarm, doesn't it? And whether it will ultimately prevent them from getting funding that they need, or the priced funding that they need in order to do the transition work.
Yeah, so firstly, I think it's again a fair remark to make. Firstly, I would say that CDP has usually taken an approach to be somewhat sector agnostic, so we don't outrule any sectors from also getting into a good scoring band in the first place. And we have actually seen quite some companies from the also what we would consider hard to abate sectors up there in the A-list range in the recent past. That is because, as I said, we are aiming to really look at companies holistically, look at the governance structures, look at the processes that they've put in place, where's the accountability on the climate side. And frankly speaking, you can also set an ambitious target without yet exactly knowing how you'll get there, right? And this is probably what we will need to see from the hard to abate sectors, especially when it comes to this long-term ambition. While you shouldn't count on sort of these innovative technologies to be happen, you should express a sense of trust that no matter what happens, this is the ambition that you're setting for yourselves. And if this is taking place, if the forward outlook is right, then there shouldn't be a fear from any of these hard to abate companies that they'll be ruled out from an investment perspective. Quite the opposite, I would actually say, because we all know the amount of investment that is required in these companies also needs to come from somewhere. And I would say there's a lot of investors that are excited to invest in these companies and to help them transition. They just want to have the assurance that the ambition is really there.
The other thing, I guess, that's interesting around your space at the moment is, you've talked about this kind of the volume increase of people reporting, amazing. The increase in targets that people are committed to, brilliant. But I mean, overall, one of the most interesting things about climate reporting, I think, is in the last 3 months, I don't know, I feel like every day, or certainly several times a week, there are articles that refer to or are specifically talking about the kind of changing expectations of climate reporting, and increasingly this kind of timeline towards perhaps mandatory reporting and so forth. So talk to us about both of those things. Firstly, what are those kind of increasing expectations around reporting, and what might that mean for how people report through CDP in the short term? And then secondly, this movement towards mandatory reporting and what that might mean.
So what we have seen is that there has been a lot of transparency already on the side of the big and stock listed companies. They're also used to this type of reporting through their annual reports or through their framework like CDP. But where we have seen less transparency in the recent past is certainly on some of the smaller companies, but also on the private companies. And this is what we'll also see coming up more in a mandatory space. So to take the example of Europe, for instance, we currently have a regulation in place, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, directive, which is, however, mostly still limited to larger listed companies. And then, to be honest, also keeps the items fairly broad. It still allows a lot of freedom how to report and where to report and so on and so forth. Now, on the mandatory side, what we can definitely see is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, meant to come into place into 2024, asking companies to also smaller companies to report, be involved in this, but also extending the criteria into looking into the EU taxonomy, but also the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, as a reporting requirement. And yeah, this is what we see happening on the mandatory side. What I would say, though, is while on the one hand, I think hopes are high that mandatory reporting will, also bring about a different level of accountability, and then also bring about the necessary changes. What we've seen in the past is that mandatory often starts with the minimum requirements and on a minimum level. And that's why we believe, even though a mandatory reporting comes into place, there's still a need to step up above that, and for companies to not just fall down on that. To be honest, many of the companies that we're working with, that you are working with, are anyways way beyond what is going to come into place as a mandatory regulation in the foreseeable future, is my gut feeling. So we need to also maintain this sense of leadership and stepping above and beyond of what's actually mandatory and required. Because if mandatory reporting would solve it all, then I think we also as an organization would be just happy to sort of put down our tents and leave it to that space. It's really important to happen, but we do still see there being a need for reporting that goes beyond this from a voluntary fashion.
All right, so kind of a final area of questioning that I think is interesting is this idea. I mean, you mentioned right at the beginning this gradual shift that CDP has been making to not just look at climate, but to look at water, deforestation, reforestation. If companies in general were taking that more integrated approach to their environmental reporting, what would reporting drive within a company like that? Why is it so essential?
Yeah, fair question. And I should mention indeed that, I did mention in the beginning that CDP currently has these three sort of distinct environmental themes that companies are asked to report on. Indeed, the idea and ambition being to integrate these themes more in the foreseeable future and ask companies to report on these in this more integration fashion, as you mentioned yourself. So firstly, I would say that there's obviously a lot of synergies if you report on themes that seem distinct, but actually have a lot of overlaps in a more integrated fashion. So just to give you a very practical example, we're currently asking some companies essentially 3 times if their governance processes capture, let's say, climate or capture water items or capture forest items respectively in 3 distinct questionnaires. So if you were to integrate this, it's essentially 3 questions get boiled down into one, and you just have to respond once and then sort of tick some more boxes in that response. So I think that's where it starts from. But from this really more action and leadership perspective, what we really want to see is that companies start to think about these in a more integrated fashion, just because of all these cross effects that I mentioned in the beginning that we see between these environmental dimensions. So if we take a food company, for instance, that is currently on the one hand reporting on their climate ambition and the action they're putting in place, and then sort of separately being asked to report on what they're doing to stop deforestation in their supply chains, it's essentially one and the same, because in order to achieve their decarbonization ambition, which is mostly related to their supply chain, they will need to ensure that the food that they're sourcing isn't coming from areas that have been logged. And so integrating these 2 elements essentially just ensures you're not isolating any of both out, but you're really looking at it from an action perspective, because that's where it needs to come from. And water, likewise, as I said, since it's so essential to the decarbonization practices that you need to implement, if you don't ensure that you have decent amount of fresh water available at the factory where you're just about to implement a new technology, then this will be a problem also for your decarbonization efforts. And this is clearly what's why an integrated view and perspective is essentially so interesting and also going to be important, I would say. And finally, and this is maybe something just also to have in mind for the longer term future. As you know, there are also even more what we would consider planetary boundaries than even the ones that we've been speaking about before, right? The attention on the climate crisis has been so high because it's seen as the one with the most dramatic and overarching impacts. But we haven't even started to talk about waste or the nutrient cycles or oceans and so on and so forth. So if we look further ahead into the future, at some point, it just doesn't make sense to ask individual questions about these things anymore, and to ask, I don't know, also a responder to respond to 10 different questionnaires. You want to know, are we ensuring our planet is staying in a healthy environment and we're not crossing any of those boundaries? So I think reporting bit by bit will explore more and more into these dimensions to ensure we're in a safe operating space, not just from a climate perspective.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating how all of those kind of areas are so deeply interlinked, and sort of better earlier questioning of new suppliers, new products, everything, can feed a stronger, more integrated strategy across that true sustainability outlook.
Absolutely.
Well, David, thank you so much for giving us your time. For those who are listening in, I guess it's the last week of September, we're hoping to launch this. David is actually joining us next week at a Decarb Connect Europe event. So if you would like to come and interrogate and poke around in the issue of climate reporting some more, do come and join us at that. But David, thanks again.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks. And looking forward to seeing or hearing some of the audience back here at the conference very soon.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, Alex, at ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.